Okay, thanks to my crushing inability to be brief, I've always lived by the adage, why say in 10 words what you can say in 100? We're running behind schedule, so we're probably going to run a few minutes over tonight, but can I just beg you, stick around, because, man, you are in for some huge, huge treats. You're gonna experience some stuff here that is going to move you. It's going to change you. Our next speaker, we are so fortunate to have him. He is the podcast host of Latter-day Stories. He is a lifetime member of the church who about 5 years ago was called into a bishopric at the time that he had two major events going on in his life. He was headed into a faith transition, and he was coming out as gay. I can't imagine, because the faith transition nearly took me apart. To try to do both at one time, I have immense respect for Kyle for just being able to communicate without slobbering all over himself right now. Thank you so much for being here, Kyle. Kyle's going to take some time to talk to us a little bit about, well, you know what? I think I'm going to let it be a surprise. But Kyle's going to share some things that I think are really, really valuable. So come on up, Kyle.
Thank you. All right, we're going to try to make this work. About 10 days ago, I was in the emergency room and then admitted into the hospital for kidney stones. I know, thank you. Who's had a kidney stone before? Yikes. Akila says I have empathy. Yeah, so this was like my fifth or sixth, and put me in the hospital, and they tell me it's because of Diet Coke. And I always see all of you drinking Diet Coke. May you get kidney stones and lay in a hospital bed. That's how I feel right now. But don't drink Diet Coke, because they're awful. At least for some of you women who compare kidney stones to having babies, your things grow up and become successful and amazing contributors to society generally. Mine sit in a plastic bag waiting for the doctor to figure out what kind it was. That's the tough part about kidney stones. Thank you to the Thrive group for inviting me to speak to you today. I promise this is always kind of a tough spot. You're after lunch, you're carb loaded, and you want to go to bed at the end of the day. But I do promise you boring information and nothing overly exciting. So you've been forewarned. And no Diet Coke, I know. And I'm running, and I don't even drink coffee either. So I don't know how I exist. I know. I want to give you a little bit of background about who and what I was and am. This picture was taken. This is the second to last family photo we took. This is my now ex-wife. Spoiler alert, I'm divorced. And my 4 kids, Avery, Kaysen, Kaylee, and Brinley. 2 bookends are twins, are lights of our life. This picture was taken in 2017. It was taken about 6 months after I came out to my wife. Anybody watch my Mormon Stories interview with John Delan? Oh, good. Thank you. More than I thought. So for the rest of you who didn't, I'm going to spare you 6.5 hours and give you the abbreviated version. I still would recommend it because it was good. I mean, it was awesome. So a couple months before this photo was taken, I come out to my wife, not by choice, because if you're a good Mormon and you do all the right things, this stuff will go away, right? A mission, marriage, children was the prescription for getting rid of homosexuality in your life. So I did everything that I was taught to do. I went on a mission, I married in the temple, and I had children. And I still woke up every morning and I was still hella gay. And I couldn't figure out what I was doing wrong to make that thing go away. So this photo was taken just before my son's baptism. I was about 70 pounds overweight. I was out to my wife. Our life was a disaster. And I was being called into the bishopric because the stake president had divine revelation that I was ready to be in the ward. And little did he know, there was an elephant in our room with a name and a rainbow cape and a lot of things going on that they had no clue. In fact, when this photo was taken, my wife and I had decided to divorce, and we were just kind of navigating that process as amicably as possible. But yet, the good Lord believed we needed to have myself in the bishopric. So how do I go from return missionary, I don't want to say madly because that seems kind of weird, madly in love with a woman, married to a woman, to then the other side of the aisle with my fiance, Jay. So that's a little bit about what I want to talk about. In the middle of this is something I talk about in my episode called collateral damage. I talk a lot about collateral damage in a lot of these opportunities to speak. And the reason why I stayed so closeted and so bottled up, and sometimes the reason why we do some of the difficult things in our life, is because we just don't want to hurt other people. So in my experience, I always had some collateral damage. It was always the kids. If I came out, it would hurt them. If I came out, what would their friends think of them? This is super familiar territory for a lot of us, because if I came out, what would my wife or what would my husband think of me? If I came out, if I showed up and said, I no longer believe, what would my Ward family think of me? What would my mom, my dad, my best friend across the street who's been my counselor for years, all of the collateral damage we start building up. We start convincing ourselves that to do hard things, the calamities of the world would befall upon us, and we would no longer find happiness, we would no longer find spiritual experiences, and there would be no joy. So these were always my periods of collateral damage. I always thought if I ever came out, I would run away and never see my kids again. Because who would want a dad who's gay? Who would want a dad who is tarnished? All these things start running through your mind. So both of these photos were taken after the divorce. I took the kids to New York City. I threw that one in there just because it had a little bit of Jay and I's story. But I took the kids, bravely took them to New York City, and we had the time of our lives. Single dad, big city, and my kids absolutely loved it. While there, I was interviewed by a group called Gays with Kids. They are a publication that just kind of highlights families who do fun things as gay families. I was a single dad, 4 kids. Gays for Kids wrote an article about me taking my kids to New York. And Jay came across that article, learned a little bit more about my story. Facebook and Instagram stalked me. Creep. And ended up writing or texting me over and over and over and over again. I would kind of give him the pleasantries like, oh, hi, thank you, great, the weather's wonderful, oh, nice fire, cool dog. Like that, those were always my responses to Jay's messages. And he was so sincere and nice and kind. And then finally he knew that if he was going to have a chance, he had to get to Utah. He lives in Minnesota. So if he was going to have a chance, he had to get to Utah and start figuring out how to have a real world connection. So in December of 2019, Jay should leave for just a second. I'm not sure if he even had a conference in Utah, but he said he was coming to Utah to go to a work conference, and he asked if I would go to dinner with him. Of course, being a sucker for food, and I was, just wildly lonely, I said sure. I took Jay up on the offer, and we were going to go to dinner, I believe it was at 7:30. I was going to pick him up at his hotel in Salt Lake. So I get to the lobby, probably at 5. It was closer to 7:30. And there's no Jay. And at 8 o'clock, there was no Jay. And at 9, there was no Jay. And at 10, there was no Jay. And at 10:30. So this is how desperate I really am, because I'm still sitting at the hotel at 10:30 at night I did have my laptop and the internet, so I was doing a little work. But finally, at 10:30 at night, Jay calls me and says, I'm running late. I think if you're still in town, I'd be willing to go to dinner. So at 10:30 that night, we went to Squatters in downtown Salt Lake, and we closed the place down and just got lost in conversation and had a really great time. But he still stood me up for 3 hours. I just want that to be known. So that's just a quick story about Jay and I. But we kind of built a relationship, and I'll get a little bit more into my story. We built a relationship in the middle of COVID with a global pandemic, living 1,600 miles apart, which was not easy. Jay is a Southern Baptist by trade. I'm a recovering Mormon. We couldn't be on different opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of religious belief. He didn't know much about Mormonism, and he just got thrown into a world with LGBTQ advocacy, an ex-wife, 4 children, my podcast, and all the things that I'm doing. And somehow, he still said yes to the dress. This was us on New Year's Day. We are kind of official. We're going to become a partner, couple, boyfriends experience. Was at a drag show on December 31st, 2019. We did kiss at the drag show and welcomed in the new year, and then COVID happened. So thank you. You're welcome. Just trying to do our part. So at that same drag show 2 years later, I proposed to him on stage, and it was a lot of fun. And he did say yes. So that means he's somewhat eternally connected. I told him, I said, Jay, I won't propose until you take me to the temple. He still has never taken me to the temple. This is our little family, grown up a little bit. I don't see collateral damage in their eyes anymore. I don't see them as collateral damage. They are our little herd, and they're just wildly fun. And we're excited to have them as part of our journey. As we brought up a little bit, I am also the host of the Latter Gay Stories podcast. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the podcast, it was originally the Gay Mormon Stories podcast that was under the Open Stories Foundation umbrella. John DeLynn started the Gay Mormon Stories podcast as an avenue to try to help tell the LGBTQ side of the Mormon story. He produced about 100 episodes or so, 90 episodes or so, before they pretty much just shelved the project. I was interested as a closeted gay guy in all of the stories. I was so interested in trying to figure out how someone was making it work. How could someone be a closeted, active Mormon, married to a woman, in a mixed orientation relationship, and still make it work? Because I was dying inside, literally dying inside. Pieces of me were just shriveling away because I didn't know how to make these two worlds work. So I was clinging on all the stories. I was trying to make a connection with all of those experiences, similar to what I think many of you have tried to do. As you're navigating your own personal journeys, some of the things that you were looking for were senses of community, trying to find people who are there to support you and lift you and be someone that you could express and share your real concerns, your real thoughts, your real successes, and your real joys with. Those were all the things that I was searching for too, but I had to do it in secret, like many of you. Because I think this is a really great opportunity to kind of have that chance to share in the mingling of experiences. When it comes to marginalization, when you speak of the LGBTQ community, that's a marginalized community. When you speak of the post-Mormon community, that's a marginalized community as well. And marginalized communities can work together because there's so many similarities. So John DeLynn had the Open Stories, or had the Gay Mormon Stories podcast, and I reached out to John, and he pretty much gave me the same treatment I gave Jay. Thanks. Hi. How you doing? Weather's nice. Nice fire. Cool. And I was begging John to please bring more stories, please, because I felt like I had been cut off at the vine. I had lost this sense of community with all of these gay stories, Gay Mormon Stories, because they just shelved the project. Dan Witherspoon, who was the host, just stopped, and there were no more stories, and I just lost my lifeline. So I continued to reach out to John and just beg him to create some more content, and he just didn't. There just wasn't any new content that was coming up. So the more I reached out to John and the more I bothered him, the more he started realizing that I was serious about trying to figure this out and trying to create community and a sense of community within the LGBTQ community. So he and I drove down. We had the opportunity to go down to St. George in 2018 for Bill Rill's excommunication. Finally, I had John captive in a white van that we sang karaoke in at the top of our lungs. John can actually sing Stars from Les Mis pretty well. You should take him up on it. And we hashed out an agreement to take over a podcast. And I took over the Gay Mormon Stories podcast. It was at the same time that the church was rebranding and getting rid of their multi-billion-dollar operation called I'm a Mormon to I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Visitors welcome. So I decided to rebrand the podcast as well and rebranded it as Latter Gay Stories. Punny and something that you could be an active Mormon and listen to it. You could be a not active Mormon. You could be not Mormon at all and find connection within the stories. So that's how the Gay Mormon Stories podcast happened. The Latter Gay Stories podcast happened. Through that, I've had plenty of opportunities to speak, and I developed a program called What to Expect When You Weren't Expecting Homosexuality. And I found my original goal with the Latter Gay Stories podcast was to try to infuse some education into the active Mormon world. Because most Latter-day Saints didn't have a connection to the LGBTQ community until they needed it. We won't connect with marginalized communities until that marginalized community impacts us directly. So where does a Latter-day Saint family go when their son or daughter or child comes out? Most would run to the church. And if you're familiar with Mormonism, the resources aren't there. And the resources that are there are Kimball resources, where you're a contagion, you're a disease, you're a malady, you're a sinner, you are a child of Satan, you are diseased, you are a victim. Those are all of the descriptors that are given to the LGBTQ community. So what I wanted to do is create a space and create a class or an opportunity to sit down with bishops and stake presidents and branch presidents and moms and dads, even around a kitchen table, to share with them what to expect when you weren't expecting homosexuality. The other half of the class was to sit down with the LGBTQ community and also help them to navigate this world healthily, safely, with grace, because I really appreciate what was spoken up here about grace. I spent a lot of time. I spent 30 years in the closet. I had 30 years to figure out what my sexuality looked like. When I told my parents, they had 30 seconds to hurry and decide and formulate an answer. I had to give them some grace and had to give them the opportunity to process and to understand and learn. And I can't hold them accountable for what they said after 30 seconds of revelation, knowing that I had 30 years to figure this out on my own. So in today's few minutes, we're going to try to kind of clash what to expect when you weren't expecting homosexuality with LGBTQ 101, because I want to give you some further light knowledge. You were waiting for that leaf to fall off. Jay was, I know for sure. At the end of the presentation, I also want the very best parts of it is to hold an open Q&A. I want you to know that I am 100% an open book. There's not a question you're going to ask me that I'm going to blush. Well, I might blush, but it still would be fun. I want you to be free to open your mind and ask any question that you want to ask. I would say, like, this is our safe spot. And our safe word is nothing. Like, you can just say whatever you want to say to me and ask me whatever you want to ask, because this is the forum to do it. And in this class, that's what I kind of try to do, is try to give people an opportunity to open up and just ask whatever you want to ask. Dying, burning questions, things that you thought were inappropriate to ask, things that you thought I could never ask that I want to know. That's what we'll save for the very end. So that's where I'm going to keep you here. That's the carrot. I first want to talk a little bit about my deconstruction of my faith through postmormonism. This was my life prior to that photo, prior to the coming out. White picket fence Mormon life. Nice oak tree that shaded me from a lot of the things in the world. And things seemed relatively nice. This should be familiar territory for all of us. We all remember that point in our lives where everything just seemed perfect, where we didn't have, the worries were manageable. We didn't have a million things that were eating at us. And then comes a time where you rip the oak tree out of the front yard. Deconstruction. Shelves break. Things happen. You come out. What is left when that oak tree leaves? A mess. It's no longer shading the home. There's a big hole in the front yard. It's completely noticeable. What happens when you got a gigantic hole in the front yard and you don't tend to it and you don't take care of it?
People talk about it.
I like it. What about your children? They fall into it. If you're in my neighborhood, pallets show up. The neighborhood's garbage shows up. Dorito bags and wrappers show up. The hole starts filling up with garbage. So we want to talk a little bit about that today. The whole point of today's lesson is to understand better. We are a marginalized community, both the LGBTQ community, the post-Mormon community. I want to create opportunities for us to understand this topic a little bit better. So when you see a box like this, I want you to put your active Mormon goggles on. Who remembers descriptors like this as active Mormons? When we're talking about post-Mormonism, yeah, it's okay. Raise your hand. You can be guilty. I won't judge, like Diet Coke. When we hear things like lazy learner, blood or oath, seer stone, John Dehlin, Mormon stories, we start putting all of these post-Mormon apostate things into a box, not wanting to acknowledge them, not wanting to deconstruct them, because, like Great Mormonism, if you speak of it, if you proselyte it, it will become you. So if we talk about it, embrace it, it becomes emboldened. And we can't do that because it'll infiltrate our houses. Even the appearance of sin is sin, right? So we remember these terms, but what about these terms? Did we do the same thing for these words? Did we bundle those in boxes and prevent ourselves from talking about and even mentioning the word gay or lesbian or bisexual in our homes? Did we ever say masculine or feminine or genderqueer or LGBTQ around the kitchen table? Often, no. And the reason for that was for the same reasons we didn't talk about things of apostasy. Like I talked about earlier, we talked about these things becoming really taboo. Many of us are uncomfortable with these words because we don't talk about them, but I want to just really quickly talk about some of the big ones. LGBTQ plus means LGBTQIA. The L stands for? The G? B? T? Q? Questioning queer? I? A? Good. When we talk about these, we typically want to bring this topic into what I have labeled into three sections: gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation. These are all too often, mixed in territories they shouldn't be mixed in. There's a difference between gender expression, gender identity, and sexual orientation. A gender identity is our innermost psychological sense of self. Gender expressions are how a person presents or communicates gender, and I'll go through these in just a second. Sexual orientation is that attraction, that who do I love feeling. So I want you to know there's a difference between the two. Our gender identity is our innermost sense of self. It is how we identify as man, woman, genderqueer, or transgender. Our gender expression is how we present or communicate our gender. This is how we dress. Masculine, feminine, androgynous, a mix of a suit and tie and rainbow-colored nails. Our sexual orientation is a little different. Our sexual orientation is who we are attracted to. It's who you love, y'all. It is whether or not you identify as straight, bisexual, pansexual, gay, asexual. This is my favorite little cartoon because this is the genderbread man.
Well done.
This is it. When we start talking about transgender experiences, when we talk about sexual orientation, remember the genderbread man. Our identity is the innermost part of ourselves who tells us who we are. Our orientation is who we love. Our expression is what people see on the outside. Our biological sex or sex is the parts we were given. And all of that can be ambiguous, and that's the beauty in it, is there's so many different varieties. One thing we often talk about, and I know this is kind of fire hose territory where I'm just shooting a lot of information, something we hear often is pronouns. Pronouns are the names in which we prefer you call us or address us. Why are pronouns important? It's the very reason why I didn't show up and say, hey, sister, how are you today? It's not appropriate in some circumstances. Sometimes we want to be called by the pronouns that we are or we express or identify. She, her, he, him, they, them. One reason why this is so important to me and why I've kind of taken half of my world and developed programs and opportunities to speak to the LGBTQ community, but also to the potential ally community and the LDS community, is because of this statistic alone. Less than 10% of LGBTQ youth hear their families express pride in their LGBTQ identity. That has to be into the 80s or 90s or 100%. We have to do a better job at fixing this. So some quick tips to be a better ally. Respectively ask some questions. If you have friends or family that you think might be somewhere along the spectrum, it's okay to respectfully ask questions. Avoid stereotyping. One of the worst things we can do is say, my nephew plays with Barbies and is so feminine, he's got to be gay. Those are types of stereotypes that aren't healthy. Or, I always knew you were super masculine and a tomboy. I figured you were lesbian a long time ago. Those are all types of stereotypes. There is no one way to be gay, that I can promise you. You want to be an ally? Be a friend first to the LGBTQ community. Attend a wedding. Don't go to a gay wedding, go to a wedding. Speak to your LGBTQ friends and family members as if you would speak to someone who is not LGBTQ. I think bridging those relationships in normal, unflowery, and the gay community would kill me for saying non-glittery stereotype. Relationships is super healthy and super important. One of the most moving experiences of my life was when a former bishop and his wife, who are super great friends and allies of the LGBTQ community, invited my partner and I to go to dinner one night and just said, you want to go to dinner? We're looking for a double date. It meant the world to us because here was someone we thought was in a position of trust and authority in the church and wouldn't want anything to do with us, proactively called us and said, hey, we're looking for someone to go on a double date with. You guys want to go? Why? It's because they just wanted to be a friend first. No religion, no talking of the Book of Mormon or Spencer Kimball or the Miracle of Forgiveness. It was just dinner over really good Thai food and fun conversation. Acknowledgement always, always wins. When we acknowledge who and what we are and acknowledge that you exist and acknowledge that, hey, here's my friends and his fiance, a simple acknowledgement of that reality goes a long, long way. So we have the house that we started with and the hole in the front yard. And I think this makes complete sense to transitioning Mormons. You can today or tomorrow or the next day choose to replant another tree in there and allow that to grow. I want you to remember that if there's nothing else, we all have familiar experiences with having that gigantic hole in the front yard by ripping that old oak tree out. Tradition and history and longevity in the church and familial ties and all those things that bonded us together under this umbrella of Mormonism. When you rip that whole tree out and you have that gaping hole in the front yard, it starts filling with trash and debris and difficult things that are tough to remove. And it becomes unhealthy. It becomes almost like a cancer, almost like a sore if you don't start replacing it with healthy things. And I think that's been amply discussed today. Some of you can choose to plant another tree And some move to different forms of religion and forms of Christianity or abilities to connect with the earth. And that's okay. Fill that hole so trash and debris and garbage doesn't fill in it. Some of you want nothing to do with trees ever again. And you're going to plant a nice little rocker out in the yard. And that's okay too. As long as you sit there and yell at the damn kids to stay off your lawn. That's what I'm doing. It's okay. And that's what we want. So I know that was kind of a fire hose, just a brief kind of introduction into LGBTQ worlds, but I do want to leave a little time for a Q&A. Again, there really isn't any formality here. If you have a question, feel free to ask it. I want to answer it, and it can be over a wide variety of whatever you'd like. Oh yeah, that's perfect. Or you can just yell it. Go ahead.
Okay, so, oh gosh, here we go.
There will be a
Really
mic. There will be a mic passed if you'll just stand up and bear your testimony.
We need hand sanitizer or
Will
something.
you please bear a pure testimony?
Okay, so my son about 18 months ago came out as bisexual. He was in his second year of college and had kind of distanced himself from us, of course, because he felt like he was, seriously, I was kidding. It's for after me. I'm so dirty. I don't know what I was saying. Anyway, what I'm asking is I've had a lot of people talk to me about their kids that are like in their teenage years or early 20s, and how do we give them good sex education about being gay? Like, there's lots of good resources, but if he's like, I'm afraid if I Google how to be gay, it's just going to be porn.
Good.
Is that bad? Like, are there good resources? I'm sure there are good resources, but we don't know what that is.
Yeah, excellent question. And I want to start that with a story. I love stories. We have some friends who lost their son, 16-year-old son, to suicide. You couldn't have found a more inclusive set of parents than these two. So inclusive that they recognize the very same thing in their son, and they're on Amazon shopping for dildos together with their son. That's how inclusive this family was with their son. And yet he still succumbed to suicide. He lost a sense of community, and that was his downfall. So being open and discussing these isn't enough just to save all the kids. There are super great resources. Natasha, who earlier spoke during the break with the Mormon Mental Health Association and Symmetry Solutions, is an excellent resource. And she's so sex positive that you'll fall off your chair, because she's so willing just to talk about hard things and make them unbelievably open and able to understand. Also from a Mormon background, lots of deconstruction there. So I would absolutely 100% every day of the week recommend Natasha and her team of therapists. Jana, Colette, they're just, all of them are so good and so well-versed there. Locally, if you don't want Mormonism's tentacles, the Utah AIDS Foundation is really good as well. Utah AIDS Foundation has some really great education, and so does the Salt Lake Community College. SLCC, SLIC has some really great programs with sexual orientation and gender identity inclusion. Peter Moosman runs that department at SLIC.
I was just going to add, sir, have LGBTQ affirming therapists and therapists who are actually LGBTQ plus. So CERC, they have Provo and Salt Lake, and I think they're trying to get one up north, I think. So
yeah, and this is kind of an epidemic that we experience, because I was 33 years old when I came out, and I had to start dating all over again. Where does a gay 33-year-old man married to a woman, formerly married to a woman, married in the temple, grew up Mormon, learn how to gay date? And in our community, it's usually you find a hookup site like Grindr and just spin the wheel and hopefully it works. And that's super unhealthy. So those places, those resources that we discussed are really great resources. Again, what I've always found is people are trying to find a sense of community. They want to know where their hurt is at. And unfortunately, they're finding that in some nefarious places. I want to try to give them, again, like the whole reason why I did Latter-day Stories, start creating groups and places where people could mix and mingle in that storefront of ideas to have them have healthy experiences to thrive. Great question.
So I have an amazing little 19-year-old that, as a mother, I suspect that is battling, internalizing some same-sex attraction, but of course is not going to admit it because he's firm in the faith. What do I do as a mother? I mean, I just want to tell me what, I'm sure hasn't processed it. So how can he tell me what he's thinking? But what do I do?
I would, great question. So I think one of the things that I found most helpful in stories on the reverse from kids who finally come out, they're looking all over the place for people who are safe. And they're looking for all of the places where they know there's an anchor. And they're also looking for places where they can run and hide if shit hits the fan. And so are you creating spaces in your home that is affirming to your son and affirming to your son's friends? Because outside of the home, he's probably got friends or has paid attention, like I did, in a completely anonymous way to those who are navigating this journey all on their own. So I would try to create an atmosphere where all things are on the table, and just know that there is never one perfect time to come out, and you should never force your child to come out as well, but allow that to naturally unfold. What if someone forced you out of the church and just put yourself in their shoes for a moment and try to figure out what resources would have helped you transition from Mormonism a little easier? Would it have been someone who would have just sat down and had a decent, fine, open conversation? Would it have been someone who opened their home to a variety of different people and experiences? So a couple nuggets of advice: just make your space a place where it's a topic of discussion, but it's not a topic of abnormal discussion. Just normal topics. I remember, shouldn't say it. I spoke at my dad's funeral, and my dad, we had a great relationship. I was 100% out. There was nothing that he loved me 100%. There was nothing that was hidden. But I remember as an 8-year-old kid going to the Homo Depot because he couldn't stand some of the gays that worked there. Like, I remember as a young kid, all of these things that led up to what I thought my parents thought of people like me, which continued to keep me closeted and keep me in that space. So I think there's some opportunities for us to apologize for our past selves, but also know that your son, I was in his position too, and there's lots of internalized homophobia, lots of fear, because they want to do the very thing that you feared the most, and that they want to avoid doing that very same thing, and that's breaking up that celestial bond. And when you're completely tied into Mormonism, the last thing you want to do is break up that eternal aspect of family. And you don't want to be the one that busts that to pieces. And so help him navigate those spaces. And I know it's difficult, but it is possible. Just to open it up and let him know that those are available.
Hello. So I have 4 children. They're still pretty young. My oldest is just barely in middle school. But I've just been thinking about this a lot. I got divorced recently last year, and unfortunately, my ex is very homophobic and a true believing Mormon. And I'm not sure what to do if any of my children were to come out or have things. I'm definitely afraid of them killing themselves, basically. And so my question is how do you approach dealing with that with someone who's the co-parent and totally paradigm shift to the opposite spectrum of what you believe? How do you handle that?
Maya Angelou, when you know better, you do better. And I think opportunities and Brene Brown, it's hard to hate someone you're close to. Bring those people. This is one lesson I learned from my ex-wife, why we were still married and kind of navigating the same world as well. One of our biggest fights, and we hardly ever fought, was over the November 2015 policy of how the church would treat LGBTQ people in relationships as apostates and excommunicate them. It was one of the hardest, and I was closeted, and it was one of the hardest discussions I ever had with her. It was one of those opportunities where it's I know now where she stands on this. I can't come out. It's just another nail in the coffin. And so one great lesson I learned from her, shortly after I come out, she said, if this is the world that our kids are going to see, we need to bring that world into our home and allow them to start having some interaction. And it was super positive for me because I didn't have any gay friends. And I had some like through my North Star chats and some of these people that I'd met online only under like levels of anonymity, I had met these people, but I never met anybody in real life. And so she gave me the opportunity to go out and meet people in real life. And then she invited them into our home and invited them over for dinner and invited them to lunch. And I remember spending Memorial Day with a gay guy who the first two people I ever saw as a gay guy was my wife and I. And that was a powerful experience for all of us. So expose. And I promise you, everything you were taught about this side of the aisle in Mormonism, where people are devoid of the Spirit and not happy and can't find joy, is just not true, because you'll find joy and happiness and spiritual experiences with a community that has so much to give, but are ostracized for who and what they are.
What if I can't keep the pronouns straight? So my daughter's given me some explanations about some things. If it's just they, them, that's simple, but then it gets complicated. Like if, it goes, if they're gay, but then if they get a operation, then it's back. Like, I'm wondering, am I going to get grace from the LGBT community if I screw up and use the wrong pronouns? Because I just don't understand it. I can't keep up with it all. It's so complicated now, from our former world.
Sure, it's a learning curve because we're coming into this space for the very first time, for all intents and purposes, eyes wide shut. And so I can promise you that from my end of this world, and for a community that I at some time represent, I will push to help them create grace and space for you as well. Because I think that's super important. What happens if you mess up? You say sorry and you move on again. We all learned this in Mormonism. The processes of repentance, right? We recognize where we did wrong. We stop doing that. We apologize and we do it no more. Just the steps of repentance. And I think if I'm gay, I'm not transgender. If I were misgendered, or someone didn't use the correct pronouns with me, it would be as simple as saying, like, I would self-recognize, I hope, and if I didn't, it's okay for them to say they, them. Or I know, this isn't outing anything, Natasha has a non-binary child, and I hear Natasha mess up every now and then, and she just stops, and she says my child instead of my daughter, and she just says my child. So someone that deals with LGBTQ people on a daily basis still messes up every now and then. But she stops even mid-sentence, and she'll make that correction, even if her child is nowhere around us. But to Natasha, it's important to her that even in Natasha's brain, she's learning to, and this isn't totally hard. How many people here changed their name when they got married? You just learn to use the new name, right? And people around you do that. And in terms of pronouns, we're using it all the time. We just don't recognize when we're using it. When someone loses keys, do we say, she lost her keys, she lost her key? No, we say, someone lost their keys. That's a simple and easy way of using a pronoun. We don't know if it's male or female keys or owned by a male or a female person. We just know they lost their keys. Just some ways in your brain to start making those connections, and then it becomes much, much, much easier. We may have went on a little longer.
All right, yeah, this may be trivial and just from some trauma with the church, but the term struggling with same-sex attraction kind of comes across to me as offensive versus just letting someone define who they are. From your side of the fence, is that a bothersome phrase, or to say same-sex attracted versus gay?
Yeah, let me tell you another story because I love stories. In 2008, there was some leaked videos that came out with the apostles around a round table in their Thursday meetings discussing LGBTQ issues. And Elder Ballard said, there's a reason why we use the term same-sex attracted. It sounds more derogatory, and we need to get that message across to the Latter-day Saints. So that's why they often use the words, and you can go to latterdaystories.com/record on the record, and you can watch the video. But that's the reason why the church uses certain language, because it helps push a narrative. Now, I'm not saying the LGBTQ community is free of pushing narratives, but in particular to same-sex attraction, and religious communities, not only within Mormonism, have used it because it feels more derogatory as opposed to same-gender attraction, which is, as we discussed with our genderbread man, completely accurate when we say same-gender relationships instead of same-sex relationships, because sex are organs, and I'm much more about the heart than, well, I shouldn't say that. Other parts are cool too. All right, are we good? Thank you. I say these things and I'm just kidding.
Kyle, thank you so much. I'm going to put Kyle on the spot, and well, I'm not going to put him on the spot. I'm just going to volunteer him to respond to questions, because I think there may be people who have other questions.
Yeah.
And I'm quite confident that if you were to email Kyle, he would respond to you.
Yeah. So latterdaystories.org is our website, but Facebook, I'm all over Facebook. Just send me a Facebook chat, and I'm 100% happy to sit down and answer your question. Jay is super kind, because he knows what I do from 10 o'clock to 2 in the morning is put out fires. But it means something to me, and I'm happy to do it, and I'm happy to try to give that not only a sense of community for the LGBTQ community, for those who are navigating this water, and I have resources and Facebook groups for your queer kids, but also for your parents as well. There are positive resources out there, secret, private Facebook groups that nobody in your world has to know anything about, that you can join. If you just want to message me and kind of give me an overview of your scenario, I'm happy to get you with people who will go to lunch with you, other mothers or fathers. There are dragon dads and mama dragons who are willing to sit down and hold your hand and navigate this world, because they were in your shoes, and you don't have to reinvent this wheel. They paved it, they've gotten rid of the boulders, and all you have to do is step on it and walk. And I promise you, your kids will follow with you, and then your grandkids and your nieces and nephews in your community, and it's worth it to them. So yeah.